Okay, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, if I may. So if you'd like to take your seats, and you can hold your conversations for later in the day when we come to questions and discussions. So our fourth session is looking at social aspects of energy, linked to energy use and the availability of fuel and the notion of fuel poverty. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce our next speaker, who is Helen Stockton. Helen is a member of the Durham Energy Institute Advisory Board, and she works for National Energy Action, which some of you may have heard about. And her particular interests are in social policy, issues relating to poverty, energy, and social justice. So I'd like to invite Helen to give her talk now.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, is that working? Great. Thank you everyone for inviting me along to give you a brief presentation today. As has already been said, I'm Helen Stockton. I'm the Research Manager at National Energy Action, or frequently known as NEA for short. Just briefly, in terms of what I'm going to cover, I just wanted to give a brief introduction to who NEA is and the issue of fuel poverty and how it's often framed as a social policy issue. Some of you are probably already familiar with the term, but some of you may not be, so I'll just briefly touch on that. Then I wanted to move on a little bit to talk about socio-technical solutions to fuel poverty or energy vulnerability, as you'll often hear it termed, and some examples of our own work. And then I'll give you a specific example of some of the research that we've been doing. It's an evaluation of a health and innovation programme. So to begin, just a very brief introduction to who NEA is. So on National Energy Action, we're a national fuel poverty charity. We first started off as Neighbourhood Energy Action back in 1981, a local charity which was originally set up by some students from Durham University. Actually, we then moved on to become a national charity in 1995. So I just briefly put there, NEA's vision is an end to fuel poverty, and our mission is to ensure that everyone in the UK can afford to meet their energy needs in the home, sufficient for good health, comfort and well-being. And so, as that probably tells you, we've kind of moved on to talk a little bit about the social and people side of energy, and moving away from more the engineering and physical sciences side of energy that we've heard about earlier on today. But I think one of the strengths of the Durham Energy Institute itself is that it acts as an arena in which those gaps between traditional disciplines can be bridged and overcome, and how we can together help to build our understanding of energy needs, energy vulnerability in a much broader sense, and how we can help overcome some of the current and future energy challenges. So briefly, what is fuel poverty? So, fuel poverty is often seen as a social policy issue, but one which spans a number of different sectors or disciplines or unique social policy issues. So in the general sense, we often talk about it in terms of housing, in terms of domestic energy, and also in terms of health. The official fuel poverty definition in England recently changed. So it used to be 10%. So if you were required, not what you actually spent, but if you were required to spend 10% of your income on energy, on the energy needed to maintain a warm and healthy home or to meet your energy needs, then you would be considered to be fuel poor. That was changed a few years ago in just England. So fuel poverty is actually a devolved issue. It's defined slightly differently in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, where they've retained the 10% definition, and we've moved on to the low income, high costs definition, which is the yellow square in this quadrant diagram, often referred to as the Hills definition, named after Professor John Hills, who developed the definition on behalf of the then Department for Energy and Climate Change. So in short, what is it? And I've got a little quote here, which is a really simplistic way of understanding it without having to go into all the workings out of around energy audits and energy requirements in the home, but essentially is the inability to afford the energy required to heat and power your home to the standard required for health and well-being. And it takes into account the required energy costs of the dwelling accounting for built form, heating systems used in main heating fuel, as well as energy costs. But it also importantly takes into account household income and average household income, where it falls below the poverty line, so the 60% median income. And this is what makes it a relative definition of fuel poverty, whereas the previous 10% definition was more akin to more of an absolute definition. So I just wanted to single out this little quadrant under the yellow square, which is called low income, low cost. And this is important because low income, low costs, given the relative nature of the new definition, is what we would consider to be a high risk group, and those often ineligible for current support and whose situation is unlikely to be substantially improved in terms of the energy efficiency of their dwellings. And this is because these households, because they don't technically meet the definition, will sometimes fall outside of the scope of current support schemes to improve the energy efficiency of homes. So while their situation may not change substantially, they are likely to become more relatively fuel poor than the technically fuel poor group, who will be brought out of fuel poverty because they qualify for support. So we really need to keep an eye on this group, because this is the group that we would consider to be the future fuel poor, potentially. So as well as the fuel poor, there's also this high risk group that we need to bear in mind as we develop policy solutions and technical and social solutions to the problem. Thank you. Thanks. So just some brief fast facts on what fuel poverty is. So we have around 4 million UK households using the 10% definition here, because that's the only definition that we can apply across all 4 countries of the UK. As I've already said, it is a devolved issue. We have 2.5 million households in fuel poverty alone in England. That's using the latest fuel poverty statistics published in 2017, but relate to the year of 2015. There's some issues around why that delay is there, which, if you're interested in the methodology of fuel poverty, do catch me later. There's an average fuel poverty gap of £353. So this is the gap between incomes and incomes required to meet energy needs. We have around 25,000 on average excess winter deaths, so that's early deaths every year. One of the highest rates in Europe, even when compared to our much colder, in terms of climate, Scandinavian neighbours of Norway, Sweden, Denmark and Finland. Around 7,000 excess winter deaths can be directly attributed to cold homes, and that's based on a synthesis of data and analysis that the World Health Organization undertook in 2011, I think that was. And then some of the consequences around fuel poverty relate to physical and mental health and well-being, and some wider social impacts around social and financial exclusion. And we currently estimate that the government will miss its 2020 target by 9 years. And when I say the 2020 target, this relates to improvements in the energy efficiency performance of dwellings and using the energy performance certificate, which requires government to bring all households, as far as practicable, a bit of a qualifier in there, to band C by 2030 and band E by 2020, and some interim targets in there of band D by 2025. And we would consider households to be effectively fuel poverty proof if they're in band C or above. So some of you who've recently moved home or had your home, or if you've either moved home in terms of buying or moved into a new rented accommodation, you'll be familiar with the EPC, the Energy Performance Certificate. It's like a graph which will show you the energy requirements and costs associated with a dwelling. So just some more information here around what we are calling a cold homes crisis and can we afford to wait. So at the moment, we estimate that the cold homes crisis, in terms of cost, is around £950 million worth of debt. So this is personal individual debt that could otherwise be spent in local economies. Not to mention the social cost of high levels of debt in local economies, and we know the damage that that can do to communities and individuals. £22 billion worth in costs to the NHS in terms of treating cold-related illness, which is around £1.46 million a year. and around 100,000 premature deaths over the next 15 years as a direct result of cold homes. So this slide just shows some of the resources that we believe are available that the government could call on to help tackle the cold homes crisis. And some of this is government resources already available. So looking at taxes on domestic energy, public infrastructure budgets, we estimate that around 20% of the government's current accumulated infrastructure resources could be diverted to tackle the cold homes crisis. And we're also calling on the government to make energy efficiency a national infrastructure priority. So, in terms of solutions, so one of the things that we often talk about in terms of fuel poverty is how it's a socio-technical problem. And by that, we mean that the problem or the issues that combine to produce fuel poverty are socio-technical. They are, so fuel poverty is brought about by low household income, poor energy efficiency of the dwelling, and higher unaffordable energy costs. And I'm sure some of you will have already heard today that fuel prices by one energy supplier are going up by above inflation, 5.5%, I think it was. So these three things are not just social, they're not just technical, and they're not just structural in the sense that they relate to the energy market. They are all of those things, and fuel poverty is produced when those three things and some peripheral issues combine, and therefore we conceive of it as being a socio-technical problem, and therefore the solutions need to be socio-technical. So, at the top of the list here is energy efficiency of dwellings to reduce costs, reduce carbon, and to improve comfort. And we have policies in place such as the Energy Company Obligation, which is a GB-wide national policy to help improve the energy efficiency of homes across Great Britain. There are also some new and innovative products being developed for deployment among fuel-poor households. So some of these will be things like air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, hybrid heat pumps, different technologies that haven't typically fallen within scope when it comes to addressing fuel poverty or energy efficiency among low-income vulnerable groups. By tackling fuel poverty, we can increase local economic activity in terms of jobs creation. So this is installers, local businesses installing energy efficiency products and measures in people's homes, and local spend. We can improve income, so tackling the low-income element of fuel poverty through benefit entitlement checks and income supplements such as the cold weather payment and the winter fuel payment. And we can reduce energy costs through improving market engagement and market innovation and bill rebates such as the warm home discount. So these are the solutions that we think can combine to help us tackle and eventually eradicate fuel poverty. I just very briefly wanted to say a little bit about the kind of research that we do at NEA. So we're principally social researchers. My background is in sociology and social research, and my colleagues have backgrounds in anthropology, ethnography, and human geography. We do research in the traditional sense around, the purpose of that would be to generate and add to the knowledge base to further the state of the art in terms of understanding the concept of fuel poverty, what the causes and consequences are, but ultimately what the practical and policy-based solutions are. Our research methods cross the qualitative and quantitative research paradigms. We tend to use mixed methods approach in most of our work. So we would undertake interviews and ethnographic approaches, but also more empirical or quasi-experimental approaches to our work as well. We undertake a significant number of evaluations to help guide decision making and to help inform how programmes are developed and designed as they deliver. So this is taking a formative approach to evaluation, helping to shape new programmes as they're being tested to make sure that delivery is optimised. And we do this to assess consequential change, and that relates to the summative element of our work, which is around outcomes and impact. So what difference does a particular policy intervention or practical measures-based intervention make to the lives of those in fuel poverty, but also in a policy sense? So what contribution do schemes make to helping the government address or indeed reach their fuel poverty targets as set out in the National Fuel Poverty Strategy. So just some quick examples around some of the research that we've done and how we seek to have impact both in a practical sense, so working with local practitioners, health workers, housing officers, environmental health officers, the energy sector, to help them to reach the vulnerable and to deliver meaningful advice or support. But also in the policy sense, so how can we have impact at a national or local policy level too? So the programme that I'm going to talk a little bit about is an evaluation which we've just completed on the Health and Innovation Programme, but I just wanted to give you a bit of a flavour of the breadth of work that we do. So we've recently published a report on understanding carbon monoxide risk in households that are vulnerable to fuel poverty. We've also done a very comprehensive synthesis review of the literature which links cold homes and ill health, and also a negative health gradient to cold homes, and that's called Connecting Homes for Health. And we've also recently evaluated a pilot and rollout phase of the Empower Fuel Bank, which was providing fuel vouchers to prepayment customers that were using local food bank who were close to or already self-disconnected from their energy. Because they use prepayment meters, as some of you might be familiar, you need to top up using a key or a card. There are two barriers that often present in that respect. You simply don't have the income or available resources to go and top up your key or card, or you can't physically access a pay point, so you might live somewhere remote, rural, or your local pay point is closed at 8 o'clock, but you've just run out at 9:30. So there are a couple of issues there. All of these reports are available on our website, if any of you are interested. So just very briefly, the Health and Innovation Programme. So this was a fairly large and complex in some respects programme, but we think it's been great in many respects. So it was a £26.2 million programme that began in April 2015, and NEA designed and developed this programme and then worked with our local partners to deliver it in local communities. It was designed to bring about affordable warmth to over 6,000 fuel-poor and vulnerable households in England, Wales and Scotland, and comprised three funds. We had the Warm and Healthy Homes Fund, a Technical Innovation Fund and a Warm Zones Fund. And it was targeted to support over 7,000 households, but we surpassed that target and directly supported almost 10,000 households at the last count. And this is across Great Britain, and we levered in an additional £13 million in gap and match funding to help us go even further and support programmes that are already delivering, but by bringing those extra funds could go on and help even more households. So in terms of the Warm and Healthy Homes Fund, this was principally targeted at those with pre-existing health conditions, some of which might have been cold-related. Often, cold-related illness will relate to respiratory and circulatory conditions, but also some neurological conditions, such as dementia as well, are associated with cold homes, and also some musculoskeletal conditions, such as arthritis as well. So we looked at delivering two types of measures, partnerships measures, which are large measures, and are more traditional, kind of, I suppose, in terms of energy efficiency measures, those you typically expect to be delivered. So cavity wall insulation, loft insulation, underfloor insulation, solid wall insulation, and heating systems, gas-fired, oil-fired, and also some did I say oil-fired? I think it was just gas and oil in health. And we also did some community training and engagement as well. Because one of the things we really think is important is about upskilling local community actors, whether those are in the voluntary sector, local volunteers, or statutory services to help support households to make the best of their measures, but also to make them aware of some of the behavioural changes that they can make in the home to help them be more energy efficient. And then we've got small measures as well. So these were typically smaller, but also included some insulation measures, but also controls for heating. So we're talking about thermostats, programmers, draft proofing, and other small energy efficient interventions. And this again was coupled with training and community engagement. The Technical Innovation Programme was a little bit more complex in that it involved measures that fall out of scope of traditional energy efficiency measures and support. So here I've just put a few examples on here, and we work very closely with our technical team who have an engineering background, who trialled and monitored a number of these technologies in a sample of our households. So this involved things like gas absorption heat pumps, domestic biomass, micro CHP, hybrid air source heat pumps and air-to-air heat pumps, and boiler flue gas heat recovery. We also trialled some battery storage and how they can be integrated and best used with other existing technologies, often with solar. And then we had some innovative smaller measures such as radiator fans, smart heating controls, boiler optimisation units, voltage optimisation units and heat recovery ventilation as well. And these were targeted at low-income and vulnerable households. So what did we do in terms of the evaluation? And I am quickly running out of time, so I won't labour the point on this. I think I've already spoken a bit about this anyway. So we took an objective-oriented approach, where how well have objectives been achieved and how well, were there any unintended consequences or any unintended outcomes. And this was principally about understanding what difference did this programme make to the lived reality of the households that we've engaged with. So what difference did it make to energy affordability? What difference did it make to their health, their mental well-being, their financial situation, household budgets and those kinds of things. But we also looked to understand what the wider impact was on delivery and the wider industry of energy efficiency. So in terms of what we actually looked at, we worked, as I said, with our technical team who did some technical monitoring looking at temperature, humidity, reductions in fuel bills, energy efficiency improvements. That's measured by something called SAP, Standard Assessment Procedure, which measures how energy efficient a home is, but is often recorded using an EPC. And also end-user advice and engagement, which is really important when you're installing new technologies in homes, is to make sure that the end user understands how to use it so they can make best use of it, and the impact will be greater. In terms of the social evaluation, I've already spoken about that, but principally we were looking at thermal comfort, physical and mental health, control over heating, how affordable they thought the bills were, and market engagement. So how interested were they in switching their energy supplier, for example, or looking at different tariffs. So just some top-level results. I've just last week finished writing the report and I'm just getting comments back on it. So the report will be available very soon. I'm very relieved the report's done. It's running at over 100 pages at the minute. So I've just included a few top-level results here because, you know, they're too many to go into in too much detail. But we've reduced subjective fuel poverty by 72%, we think. And what I mean by subjective fuel poverty is people's ability to achieve affordable warmth. So the question asked is, can you usually keep your home comfortably warm in winter or when it's cold outside? And it's yes or no. And if no, is it because it costs too much? You can't keep it on for as long as high as you would need to be comfortable. You don't have adequate heating or insulation measures in the home, or combination of those two things. So for the people who said that no, they couldn't keep their home comfortably warm in winter, we reduced by 72%. And those that could not keep their home warm for reasons of cost and or poor energy efficiency fell from 72.8 to 20.1%. Fuel poverty risk, we found, was primarily cost-driven. So this is about not being able to afford the energy rather than because they don't have adequate or suitable heating or insulation. And before measures went in, the number of people that attributed their difficulty with energy affordability was 52%. Afterwards, although a much smaller group said that they couldn't afford to heat their energy, like 2/3 attributed that to cost. So even after they've had energy efficiency measures. And I think what's really important there is it's coming back to this idea of socio-technical solutions. So you can deliver a very technical intervention, but that must be coupled with interventions that address the two other elements of the fuel poverty conundrum. So We can address energy efficiency, and we very much think that energy efficiency is the most sustainable and rational way of tackling fuel poverty. It's something we have a lot of control over. We have less control over people's incomes and less control over energy costs. But those two other elements of the fuel poverty conundrum absolutely must be addressed alongside energy efficiency if we are to suitably address fuel poverty and eventually eradicate it altogether. Very briefly, in terms of health, we had some, over 2/5 reported an improvement to pre-existing health conditions. That was more pronounced among those that had cold-related ill health. We have increased comfort, we found, was associated with improvements to general physical and mental health and those with pre-existing conditions. So we found a correlation there in that people who, the more you were likely to report increased comfort, the more likely you were to report improvements to your general physical health, mental health, and to any pre-existing conditions. And this was particularly so the correlation coefficient and was stronger for cold-related conditions, and those that reported increased comfort were more likely to report an improvement in mental well-being. So this is not in terms of diagnosed health conditions, but more generally their well-being, so confidence, how happy they feel generally at home, how likely they are to engage in social events and those kinds of things. And then just some monetised benefits of the interventions. So we calculated that interventions produced 31.5 QALYs, resulting from the health-based interventions alone. And a QALY is a quality of life, quality adjusted life year, which is a measure of cost efficiency used in the NHS, and in particular NICE, for deciding whether an intervention is permissible on economic grounds alone. So the most cost-effective measures that we found solely on health grounds as measured by NICE, which calculate around £20,000 per quality adjusted life year, were loft insulation and cavity wall insulation. They're much lower cost measures, but produce a significant effect, or can produce a significant effect in terms of health. The health programme is estimated to have delivered almost 700,000 of benefits in net present value, so the difference between inputs and outputs in economic terms over the lifetime of measures. And benefit entitlement checks, where they were provided, so it was principally in our Warm Zones Fund, have resulted in £6 million per annum in confirmed additional benefits. So in real terms to households, that's over £2,000 per household in additional income. So that might be where someone's maybe not in receipt of a means-tested benefit. And a really good example is pension credit. We know only 2/3 of people who are eligible for pension credit are actually claiming pension credit. It's really important, pension credit, because it passports people through to other support, namely the Warm Home Discount Scheme, which is a rebate on your energy bills. So it's really important that people are claiming the benefits they're entitled to, because it opens up a whole range of other support. And things like child tax credit and working tax credit, when they were around, were also really important. And that's it from me. I think I might be 5 minutes or so over. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce our next speaker now, who is Janice Asprey from the Department of Geography here at Durham. And Janice is going to be talking to us about understanding and addressing energy vulnerability, looking at a project where Durham Energy Institute has been working with the London Borough of Haringey. So have you got your microphone?
I should say that oh. All right. Yeah, I should just say that I go back and forth. I'm a geographer. I go back and forth between geography and anthropology here at Durham, but the energy vulnerability work is the work of the anthropology department, although it's a mix. So I am going to try to complement Helen's presentation, whereas she spoke about the sort of research evaluation within the policy field and the activist field. I'm going to talk a bit about the perspective from academic research. And where Helen talked about a national program and a national evaluation, I'm going to be quite specific and local, because all of this work has been over about learning along with a local council and different actors in the community over several years. Sorry. So fuel poverty is the term that is broadly used in the UK, and I talk about fuel poverty a lot as well because that's what people know, and they'll know what I mean. But in academic terms, for the last decade or so, we've begun to talk about energy vulnerability. And whereas fuel poverty is the state, energy vulnerability is the risk of falling into it. And the risk factor is important because very often vulnerable people are really on the edge. And if one thing, a health problem, a difficulty with a family member, a change in income, everything can fall apart. So actually starting to look at the process before they're in dire straits, and they usually will wait until things really fall apart, is really important. So we think of energy vulnerability as the propensity of an individual to become incapable, and the incapable can happen for many different reasons, to secure a materially and socially. So as well as meeting our basic needs, we need energy to go out washed and ironed, to work and to school. Now we increasingly need a computer attached to the internet, etc. We need a level of comfort in our home that allows us to invite people around, etc. So and we talk about energy services. So rather than speaking about fuel, which is the carrier for the energy services, we try and focus more on the benefits, the cooking, the eating. And the reason for that is because it means we can address it somewhat from a different perspective in terms of policy. So instead of saying, I have a demand for X number of kilowatts, we can talk about sort of adequate levels of lighting, so the use of energy services. So it's essentially the same things, but with a bit of a shift in. And when someone is energy vulnerability, we would say it's due to ineffective operation of the socio-technical pathways, which NEA also is very focused on the social and technical, because it's never just the boiler, it's the practices in the home, it's the policy, it's how the company that delivers work, et cetera, and we need to look at all of that. So when we study energy vulnerability, we examine these broader conditions and dynamics. Durham got quite involved in this area about 10 years ago when it was one of the members of the interdisciplinary cluster on energy systems, equity, and vulnerability. NEA was another partner. It was a mix of academic and practitioners. And one of the things that came out of that was an interest in energy justice and the right to energy services. And Brenda Boardman, who was the person, the academic, who raised the alarm in around 1990 about fuel poverty, had stressed when she sort of came back to talk about how to fix it, that we need to be clear that these are essential services on the level of food and shelter, etc. It's not discretionary. So the inclusive, this interdisciplinary cluster, took that and looked at what does that mean, justice? What does it look like? And actually broke it down into three forms of justice or injustice. So the one we'd be more familiar with is the distributional injustice, and coming back to those key reasons for fuel poverty, which are about income, which are about the cost, and about the energy efficiency of the home. So that's basically you don't get your fair share of the energy. You don't get what you need. But there are also procedural injustices. So as we can see along that top bit, we've got the access to information, we've got access to channels of participation, that you have a way as an energy vulnerable person to actually influence the policy that can help you, and also lack of recourse. So if you have a problem, if you're being billed unfairly, if things are priced unfairly, that you can actually do something about it. And the last one is recognition injustice. And what that means is when we talk about equity, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're all equal in need, Because if you're an older person who is at home more and perhaps moving less and needs to stay warm, if you're a young family who similarly are at home and having lots of energy needs, your situation is different and you need to be treated differently. And the other recognition in justice is about cultural and political respect. So the idea that certain groups of people are thought to be less worthy of concern because they don't work enough or they belong to a certain cultural group. So all of these areas make up the three forms of injustice. So we set out 3 years ago to apply this in working with the Haringey Council. Haringey Council somehow connected with the Durham Energy Institute in about 2013-14 and said, we have this very ambitious low carbon goal of reducing our carbon emissions by 40% by 2020. We've been told that by the Carbon Commission that helped them develop this, that we need to get to grips with questions of inequality and vulnerability, because Haringey is London's most unequal borough. It has literally the railroad tracks running down the middle, separating quite well-off areas from areas of deprivation, including extreme deprivation. And those largely overlap with the areas of fuel poverty, part of which is about lack of income, but also a lot of it is about the quality of the housing. Very poor quality housing, a large and increasing percentage of it is from the private rented sector, and people are paying high prices for really bad quality. So we in our group in Durham said, well, what we can do is we can help you to understand what's going on in terms of both how are people experiencing this, what are the problems, and also what is already happening to address it. And is there something we can do to strengthen that and work with it so that you can have a just low carbon transition? So we started out in an anthropological sort of way of doing participatory observation and interviews and trying to really carry out a sort of ethnographic study that we would get into the detail of people's experiences in their homes and also of the organizations that were working in the area and how they were trying to deliver it. So we found a number of things. Probably one of the first was very much that this is only one of many stresses. So it cannot be looked at in isolation and is often intimately related with various social and health issues. We found that the fuel debt is a growing concern. So increasingly people are going into the Citizens Advice Bureau with financial problems, deeply in debt, dealing with payday lenders, and when the questions are asked, it's about their energy costs. People struggle. All of the suggestions to them that they, check out their choices and, take advantage of the energy market. It's just very difficult for many people. And a lot of difficulties interacting with energy suppliers because often, as probably many of you have experienced, you'll get someone on the phone who has a very limited capacity to deal with things, and it's very hard to get to the person. One of our best stories was a woman who was getting a bill for £17,000 for a year for her one-bedroom flat. And when she rang, she was told, those are what's in our records, till finally an energy advisor helped her and said, do you think she's running a factory in her flat? The other thing we saw, sadly, because one of the things where we would try to provide is retrofitting opportunities to get that energy efficiency, but a lot of people had very bad experiences when the initial subsidies for loft insulation were offered, for example. All sorts of companies appeared out of nowhere and went in and did it, and it was a mess, et cetera, et cetera. So in general, vis-a-vis all of these different companies and providers, there was just a general lack of trust. Also, incredible misunderstanding of energy technology. So yeah, Helen and I were just talking about the situation where there's a very fuel-efficient boiler, and it's turned off because the person doesn't know how to work it, and instead an energy-wasting fan heater is going in the corner. Energy performance certificates, which are an interesting tool. When you rent and buy, you're supposed to be presented with one. They also list the things that you can do to improve your energy efficiency, just largely ignored. And often, even if people did have that information, if they're dealing with the private rent sector, often they're fearful of actually confronting the landlord because of this problem of so-called revenge evictions, where if they ask for any repairs, they'll be out and replaced. So there was a general feeling of just disempowerment, that people felt, I'm struggling with this, but wherever I turn, I can't do anything. And also something about the nature of energy itself, because it's actually invisible, it's hard for people to engage around it or solve problems. So people end up seeking help about energy through the route of going for debt help. And when they're thinking about how to change things at home, often they don't know where to start, and when their bill's getting too high, they'll just turn everything off. Or people will be happy to stay with prepayment cards because at least they feel some sense of control. When the money runs out, it turns off. So we took these, and I'm not expecting you to read it, just to show you our process a little bit. We took this sort of ethnographic information we had gathered and organized that into these different types of injustice, and then created beginnings of a system map, which was, if you ever feel like getting dizzy, you can follow our links. It's a Prezi, so it goes in and out, and it zooms in on the different things. So we were able to try and think within those different types of injustice what was happening in Haringey. So we highlighted the fuel debt when we were looking at the distributional justice, access to energy services. We highlighted the housing situation. And we also, in our distributional justice, because we're looking at just low carbon transition, we also added access to lower carbon alternatives. So in the wealthy side of the borough, there's microgeneration around solar on public building, and people have investments in that. In the area that most needs it, those opportunities haven't been seized. There's people who are interested in doing it, but they need help. Similarly, there was, gardening projects, cycling projects to offer low carbon and very cheap alternatives. So with that, we then put that in the center, and we tried to go and look at what are all the assets in the community. So we have those squares are actual physical places and spaces. The circles are organizations. The broken squares are activities. To try and then they're grouped around these different dimensions of justice. So we could then see what do we have, what do we not have, what is working, how could these be aligned in a way that it would add up to a solution. So what we saw when we looked at that is we saw a lot of it has to do with personalizing things. So as opposed to somebody goes, it's loft time, or here I am with your warm home discount, a bit of subsidy, and everybody gets one of those. When there was an organization that could actually sit down with them and say, what's your problem? There's different facets to it, let me help you. Even better if some sort of relationship is built up. So when we look at the injustices of recognition, in cases where certain communities are excluded, if there was a local organization who was trying to directly respond to their needs, their young parents or their people who are struggling with literacy or et cetera, somebody is there to help them. We also found the home visit, and my first slide of the green doctor, the groundwork green doctor with her van, going around to do the home visits and do the assessment and try and solve problems, is one of the best ways to get a sense of the person and their house, and to be able to go in and within a couple of hours have a really full view and be able to support them over time. So we were, and also the green doctors always do immediate things. They'll always do some small measures, some draft proofing, some radiator reflector, and ideally can direct the person to some of the larger measures. We looked at some things that had worked to some extent, so collective energy switching, getting everyone together and basically putting in a bid to another provider. Fantastic. Some people say £400 a year, but it only lasted a year, and then they needed help again. Training providers across sectors. NEA offers fantastic training, and people benefited from it greatly, but because of this stop-start funding and budget cuts, they don't stay in their jobs. So 6 months later, there's a whole new cohort of people who need training. And generally, also the advice providers who were often the front line, because people were coming to them with issues of fuel debt, they're not that comfortable talking about energy efficiency. So there was also a need to develop their capacity or often put them in contact with someone else. One of the things that was very disappointing to us, we did this first piece of work in parallel with a smart homes program that was providing funding for large measures, so some of that solid wall insulation, et cetera. They weren't reaching the most vulnerable because they were organized around certain financing schemes that made them inaccessible. And also it's just easier to deal with people who don't have a lot of problems. So unfortunately, and this question of when you're investing, can you not get your sort of triple bottom line? If you're doing low carbon, can you not also get health and well-being and justice? So, and then just in terms of what missing, I think ongoing support so that these groups can do their work, they can keep doing it, they don't have to keep starting from zero, the relationships of trust are developed, and that all these things are connected up. Because we actually have examples of everything necessary in Haringey, but it's not well enough funded and it's not well enough connected. What we did see too is we saw several examples of integrated approach involving multiple partners that responded to this range of needs. So this was a program that received lottery funding for low carbon transition with hard to reach communities. And what they did is they very much understood the bringing people in from any door. So they would have community gardens, they would have meals, and then once you came to that, then there was an energy advisor. Then there was a green doctor that would come to you not just once, but several times, so that you could get your first bit of help. You could go back, see what's working, get some more. And also it meant that people could make commitments to changes in their practices, and the green doctor could say, so how are you doing with your turning off the lights, etc. And it was also very much about developing personal relationships with everyone involved. The other important thing about PAT is developing, the situation of people having lack of access to jobs, particularly stable, well-paid jobs, is obviously a massive influence on their vulnerability. And the opportunities are all around people because often they're living in a situation where there is some investment in some of this retrofitting. There are large-scale regeneration projects underway, and local people could do those jobs, and often they don't get them. So Pat was really in the forefront in trying to identify what sorts of training were required, recruiting people initially as volunteers, getting job experience. And also during this time there was development of the RetroWorks co-op, which was about trying to match the advocates, the people who knew who needed work done, with the local providers, and setting that up as a cooperative. So Pat had tried to work with them. Even still, they struggled. That in the end of the day, they were still having problems with employers hiring people. So they actually had to go back and sit down with the employers at the beginning saying, we want you to fund some of this training, and we want you to commit to at least interviewing people who go through it. And then when we reached a point where we sort of had a number of ideas about what sort of things would be effective, there was a wonderful opportunity of NEA offering its Warm and Healthy Homes Fund. And this was very interesting to people in Haringey because it was about large measures, and they were directed specifically at energy vulnerable people. So we set out to actually compare pathways to delivering it. So while the end result was, you've got a new boiler and you have your new insulation, etc., we compared just giving them that, so where someone in the council goes around and says, you need X, here it is, or whether we could offer them that through the Home from Hospital program that Bridge Renewal Trust was offering, or the social isolation program in building community. If we could get the green doctors to bring their thing together with the installation. So we compared 4 or 5 different versions of that. And we also looked at what was happening in Enfield, which was one of the other boroughs and that got the funding. It was a consortium who were trying to really make the link from the Citizens Advice Bureau, where most of it comes in, through to HEAT, which does the home energy visits and is an excellent comprehensive and make sure that the work went through retrofit work. So our findings were that integrated approaches really work, which should be sort of obvious, except that's not often what we get, because often there's a specific scheme to do a specific thing, and the different organizations aren't communicating and collaborating because they've got no funds to even do the basic of what they do, never mind be strategic. We also were, so trying to move to a situation where you have a sense of the whole person and their home, which is difficult with schemes that say this is just about boilers or just about something else. But if a local authority can actually do its homework ahead of time and begin to develop this list, as Haringey is doing, proper use of energy performance certificates to select the technical interventions as well, and the need for an effective and efficient referral system. And currently, too, that is underway, and the most promising example is SHINE, Seasonal Health Intervention Network, that is now piloting and offering connections to about 35 different services. So that's it. If you want to read about it in detail, we do have a report on the DEI website, and I'd be happy to hear from you.
Okay, thank you both very much. We have time for maybe some short questions on your presentations before we move to the final closing session. So I've got a list of questions in front of me here, and I'm looking at one from Alan Swindale, which is about subsidies for wind turbines. I'm not sure.
I think that's a more technical
yes,
question.
I think that's...
People to ask
okay. Okay, well, thank you very much. In that case, then, I'll open the floor up if anyone has any specific questions about either of these 2 fascinating presentations we've just heard. Yes.
Do you feel that there is a need for an understanding of what a unit of fuel should cost? There's been lots of talk today of levels of cost, but I do query whether the efforts made with vulnerable housing actually are breaking through the surface at all. I don't know how much effort is given for people to move into smaller accommodation, which is cheaper to heat. How much is being wasted or causing other problems with outside insulation. Haringey might be the worst example, but who controls it under voluntary organisation leaves me, as an ex-architect, worried who's in control.
Complex system.
Do you have anything? So, in terms of, are you thinking about kind of moving from large houses to smaller houses? Is that your question?
Yes.
Okay, so there's something called under occupancy, which I'm sure as an architect you're probably familiar with the term, but it's, you know, it involves something called the bedroom standard, which is a calculation that is done on the number of occupants, the sex of the occupants, and the age of the occupants. So I think there are some some discussions around downsizing or moving to alternative properties. But I think one of the challenges with that is that often people have lived for a very long time in their home, and there's the psychology of home, I think, which often we need to take into account. So if people have lived there for many, many years, there'll be all the memories of that. Their family has maybe grown up in that home. And I think there can be sometimes psychological barriers to convincing people that it's a good idea. So I think it's about how do we articulate, or how do we convince people of the merits, perhaps, if they do want to move, if they're inclined to move. But I think one of the challenges with the UK is just the quality of our housing stock, and the amount of investment in terms of infrastructure investment that's been made in more than recent years, actually, when we look at the quality of the stock in Europe as a comparison. Is there anything you want to add?
Any other questions? Yes, we have some over here.
I've got a couple of questions. Firstly, could you update us on the present state of prepayment meters? Because I remember that the government was aware, obviously, these things are far too expensive, and things have been done, but I mean, how does their cost compare now to those of us who pay by direct debit, etc.?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So in the past, prepayment meters have typically been much more expensive than any other payment method. Maybe about 5, 6, 7 years ago, there was an investigation by Ofgem, the energy regulator, into fair pricing within the energy market, and that investigation, is ongoing in the sense that they're always looking at fair market practices. But in terms of prepayment meters, the cost of prepayment meters were actually equalised to standard credit. So that is your retrospective billing, your quarterly billing. So that was an intervention made by the regulator. So now, the last time I checked, the average prepayment meter bill for dual fuel was broadly the same as standard credit. It is always going to be cheaper to pay by direct debit because of the cost to serve. And that was one thing that Ofgem particularly looked at, is the cost to serve that particular payment method. Prepayment meter will be a little bit more expensive because the energy supplier has to service the meter, and there's other issues around debt collection and things that all have cost. But online direct debit, so online account management with direct debit, is always cheaper, but there are lots of challenges there around how suitable or even how wanted those payment methods are for people who maybe operate in a cash economy, don't have access to transactional banking services. So there are challenges there, and there's a report was done a few years ago on the additional cost that low income or those that live in poverty have to pay compared to more affluent households. I think it was called the poverty premium. And we've recently published a report called Bridging the Gap, which is about the additional cost that the vulnerable pay in order to achieve the same level of service as non-vulnerable households.
Right. Secondly, you are a charity, the NEA is a charity, but do you to any extent operate as a pressure group on government, on Parliament? Because it would be in your interest to do so, but I'm not sure whether you're allowed to.
Yeah, so we are a registered charity and we operate within the charity rules and regulations, but we are principally a campaigning and lobbying organisation. So while I wouldn't maybe necessarily describe us as a pressure group, we are principally campaigning and policy advocacy work. So we have, my team sits within the Policy and Research Directorate, and a lot of our work is about providing the evidence to underpin our policy and practical work and to uphold us, if you like, as the expert voice on fuel poverty. So we can make those cases to key decision makers, whether that's national, European government or local government. But we also have delivery and operations as well. So we test out and trial what we think are the good practical interventions, the training for key frontline workers that we think are essential for addressing fuel poverty. And then together with our research evidence, we feed that up to our policy work and then use that to campaign at multiple levels and with the energy sector as well, not just government and decision makers.
Okay, thank you. I think
there's somebody, I'm asking a question on behalf of somebody.
Thank you. Rod Harp, Gisborough. Yes, I have worked in the chemical industry, and I apologise, I'm aspergic when I stood up this morning, so I reacted. I remember the 1973 fuel crisis. I remember all these questions being asked then, when the average pigsty in Denmark was far better insulated than the average British house, virtually all British houses. The pigs were happier than your residents, because they looked after pigs. Now, one of the things that surprised me about this, you went very quickly through the equipment that you can use. Now, one of the things is, for example, heat pumps, which are reverse refrigerators, as we've said, and they can sit as a box outside your house and replace your central heating system. They take the energy from the air. It's better if you've got water supply or ground, but energy from the air. You get a payment for the government for every kilowatt of heat you transfer into the house. Just like the solar panel people used to get proper money for the amount they generated until the Department of Energy bowed down to the Treasury. It is here, I think, when you're talking about that, loft insulation, cavity wall insulation, they are very quick. And by the way, I would add hot water tank. You can insulate a hot water tank and save money within months. But we've got to talk about payback to this audience, because I had my solar panels put in, and when they said a 25-year guarantee on the panel and the microelectronic inverter on the back, I went, oh, will I be alive when I'm 93? It makes you think when you're going to die. So it is payback to this audience that I think is important. You've spoken of those in poverty, but these people, I do think, need that. And one real question. Every person you interviewed, particularly about CO poisoning, did you give them a CO meter?
We did.
Good.
Yeah, we used a toxiroom meter
Well
to
done.
measure, and then we gave them a detector. Everyone got a detector, yeah.
I'll try and keep my question brief. I was just wondering, is there a danger of euphemism here? That by replacing fuel poverty with energy vulnerability, you're playing the government's game, and that using terms like the ineffective operation of the socio-technical pathways do I need to say more, really? Really, what that means is I haven't got a bank account, therefore I can't pay by direct debit. Okay? The third question was, because you're doing ethnography, Janice, how did people identify themselves? Did they see themselves as fuel poor? Did they see themselves as energy vulnerable? How did they identify?
Yeah, I think people don't see that, because it's a way of, it would be like saying my identity is this, but no, they don't see that. But what they'll talk about is I am dealing with this challenge and this problem, which adds up to energy vulnerable or fuel poor. But yeah, I mean, I think it's well, I did say I was going to give you the academic research lens currently, but I find it helpful actually to have different languages to talk about different things, but it doesn't necessarily mean I'd use them in all circumstances or think they'll solve things.
What was their language?
Yeah, sorry?
What was their language?
Well, it depends very much on the person, but usually it was that I have a problem and I don't know what to do with it, and this energy company won't do this, and there's a terrible draft coming through here. So yeah, it was about the particular experiences, not so much as their identity. And people are in a great actually a great variety of situations as well. There's all different reasons why things are going badly. So
I was just going to quickly add to that. So we're a national fuel poverty charity, and we have what we call project development coordinators who work directly with households and consumers, and they would never use the language of fuel poverty. They would never talk about fuel poverty in the way that we as professionals or campaigners do. But what we do in a lot of our training is we train frontline workers to identify triggers for vulnerability or aspects of vulnerability, and they might be to do with the individual or they might be to do with the property. So these are things that we would train people who are going into people's homes to observe, not just in terms of the conversations that they have with householders, but to observe in their behaviour, in their practice, in the dwelling itself, that might be indicators that energy affordability is a problem. But I think you're absolutely right, because a lot of people, for whatever reason, won't ever want to identify themselves as being poor, in poverty, in need, for whatever reason. And so, you know, I mean, sometimes that will be the case. People will identify in that way, but typically it'll be manifestations of the problem that you're able to pick up on, rather than having that very direct conversation.
If I may just make a comment, I mean, you mentioned about a danger of risk of playing to the government's agenda, which is an interesting comment. I mean, it seems to me that, in one sense, I think it is really important that we all engage with government, partly to help them understand the complexities of these issues, because government will turn its spotlight on a particular issue. It may commission reports, it might have parliamentary committee of inquiry, it might engage with charities, and then at some point it says, right, we've got all the information we need, we're going to make a decision, we're going to put in place some framework. Levers is a terminology government likes to use, and they put in place financial incentives. And you know, it's clear that they don't always get that right. The whole history of looking at the solar feed-in tariff and the recent large payout that the government has had to make is evidence of that. But I mean, I also think it's important that, you know, organisations like these use what's available from government to best effect. And so I think, you know, for me, I think it's really important that they enable people to access these schemes that are drafted by civil servants in Whitehall that probably don't have much of experience of the reality of the environment. And then, you know, how do you translate a government scheme into action? You know, so you need facilitators like that. So although I agree that sometimes government doesn't always get it right, and it's easy to criticise, I think it's important that, you know, we do try and inform the debate, and certainly that's what the Durham Energy Institute is doing in terms of position papers and policy and so on. And I think, you know, we should also encourage and support, you know, actions like this that at some level translate the complexity of the whole energy system down to an individual who's looking at some problem that doesn't understand what the problem is, doesn't have the vocabulary to articulate to someone else what the problem is, and just knows they need help. And I think that's where, you know, the really valuable work that's done comes into play. So I think, I realise we're running slightly late behind our agenda, but I think it's probably time now if we move to the final session about the questions and the sum up and thanks. So I think, John, are you looking after that session? Thank you both very much. Thank you. This one over hand.
So, here we are at 4 o'clock or thereabouts, just after. And the final session really is down to you, the audience. We still have Douglas, Janice, Helen, Jackie. I can see a number of people from the Energy Institute around the room. Are there more questions? Plenty. Undoubtedly, to stay with the musical theme, there are more questions than answers. So there we go.
Hello. What's happening with development of hydrogen-powered vehicles? I would have thought hydrogen would be a much more useful fuel than electricity. When you think about having to stop your car and leave it overnight charging up, and you've got to find a suitable charging point, it seems to have gone very, very quiet.
I'll pitch in with half an answer, and then I'll invite any other colleagues to reply there. I know, for example, that Birmingham University, within their engineering department, have one of the leading groups looking on towards developing that into a more commercially viable piece. I did ask them when I was there, because I was their external examiner, where they got the hydrogen from, and it would seem they got it from, is it methanol reduction or something like that, basically from fossil fuel, which wasn't the answer I was hoping for. Clearly you could electrolyse water to provide hydrogen and just liberate oxygen into the atmosphere. So I think that there is an opportunity there, but there are also some other problems to solve with hydrogen, if I understand things correctly. There are issues with hydrogen because, unlike methane, which is only explosive in very specific proportions of air to methane, hydrogen is explosive. Although when the British, they were before the Royal Air Force, well, the Air Corps or something like that, shot down a German airship in 1914 and it didn't explode, they assumed it was filled with helium. It wasn't filled with helium, it just didn't explode. But as the Hindenburg disaster showed, it is particularly dangerous in all kinds of mixes. In terms of spiking it into the existing now North Sea or natural gas network, that is going ahead on very low proportions, but it's this explosive piece which is thwarting us. I know it can be absorbed into palladium, I think, but there we go with another rather exotic species. That's as far as I can go. It's only part answer. Anyone else from the group? Oh, Helen, thank you.
Not in respect to cars and transport, but I know there's some research beginning to look at hydrogen as a replacement for the mains gas
yes,
network.
That's in the Leeds area, spiking it into mains gas.
I think the really interesting aspect of that, is you know, aside from the engineering side of things, is the public acceptability of that. And I think if it's going to be a success, then winning over the consumer is going to be a major part of you know, accepting hydrogen as a main heating fuel. Or
what you can do is, and I've suggested it to some Libyans before there was the Arab Spring, put a load of, I was training some Libyans on oil refineries. You can put a load of solar panels in the Sahara and generate export electricity and generate hydrogen from the sea and store the hydrogen, and well, you don't need to store the oxygen, and then burn it in the night period for export of electricity into Europe across the Gibraltar Gap. Or if you're really brave, go round the Israeli way. But still, that's how you can use it.
Use hydrogen,
You use hydrogen for solar for immediate, but also generate hydrogen.
And this,
it also explodes, by the way, when you let it out from high pressure, like 2,000 pounds per square inch in old money. In a bottle, if you open it, that is sufficient energy of it exiting through the valve to ignite. And in perfect conditions, it's 9,000 feet a second at the flame speed. Yeah, it went past me once, and it was a brilliant shave.
Thank you. Question in the lady in the dark cardigan, please.
Microphones from all sides. Cathy Clegg. There was recently an application for an open-cast coal mine, new open-cast coal mine at Druridge Bay on the Northumberland coast. And that was originally approved by the County Council and then subsequently called in by the Secretary of State and rejected. Is there a case for any more coal mines, whether open-cast or otherwise, in Britain?
Depends how you, I don't know, depends how you enunciate the case. Clearly, there is plenty of coal left in Britain, and some of it is near to surface. I think this is a very personal view. I think there are, in many ways, easier alternatives at the moment, and it's probably a little retro to continue to mine coal. It is, because it's basically carbon, you don't get any of that benefit. If you burn gas or even petroleum, you've got hydrocarbons, so part of your emission is simply water vapour. With coal, it's all CO2 or the occasional bit of nitrogen and sulphur oxides, which need scrubbing out. I'm not convinced we need to develop much more of the coal in the UK. If, and there's an if here, we are much more sensible about what we have developed in so far as you heard from Charlotte about the shallow geothermal. There's enough hot water sitting close to our major population centres, either through flooded coal mines or simply because they sit on what are called sedimentary basins to provide our heating requirement for 100 years. At least, that's without putting cold water back in the ground. And that's essentially zero carbon. There's almost no surface footprint as well. And if you go to Heerlen, you'll not see how good it is because it's hidden. So I think from that perspective, when I first arrived here, I thought clean coal would be the future. That is an oxymoron to many people. In practical terms, it's not really. So I think it is, for us at least, the fuel of yesteryear. Having said that, and this is a very, very personal view, I've been involved, unfortunately, with a threat to build a 5,000 unit intensive pig factory next door to me. And smell apart the emissions from that in terms of greenhouse gas emissions dwarf anything else in Durham. And on another note, if you had a coal strip mine or even a fracking site, it would be very carefully monitored and bunded. What will happen to the effluent from those 5,000 pigs is it will be flung on the land. And so whilst I think the coal piece is, for me, it certainly is a fuel for Europe, for the UK of yesteryear, you need perhaps to look at some other things that we do. And everybody says farming is natural, not in the intensive factories that produce the cheap meat that we desire. So there are other things to think about as well. I would not mind too much. So whilst I say, yes, I don't think we should use it, I would not mind too much if a strip mine was there for 5 years and then disappeared off, personally. But that's just a personal aspect. But I don't think we need to. Anyone else? Maybe from the social side? Well, just answering the question. Maybe, is anyone else from our lot? Yes, the lady at the back. Is this just a comment on the coal?
Well, I have a question. I don't know if there's a regulatory entity in the UK who protect the rights of poor communities when there's a new energy infrastructure project.
Does anybody care to? Helen again. Sorry, I thought you were going to follow up on the coal. I'll come down here in a minute. So. Yes, keep us busy, Helen.
So the Energy Regular Ofgem has responsibility for protecting vulnerable consumers in terms of energy, but then there's also Citizens Advice who've recently taken over some consumer protection in relation to energy in the same way as it does for the Postal Service. So it used to be Energy Watch, but there's been a few iterations since then, and now it now sits with Citizens Advice. Otherwise, it's Ofgem.
We had several questions in the centre. The gentleman with the blue and red striped tie, first of all, and then is it Mike? Is it in the check jacket? Yeah.
In the first session, we were told increased technology, increased energy use. We were also told increase in population, increased energy use. Also, the higher energy, as we use it, ends up as low-grade energy.
Sorry, the higher energy ends
that we're
up...
using to convert into what we need, either rotary engines or...
Yeah.
All the energy will end up as low heat energy in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
So, if the Earth is a closed system, is it like a room with a low wattage power in it that slowly heats up, or is there some way of the Earth managing to get rid of all this excess energy that we keep creating?
Excess heat. That's a delightful question. I thought where you were heading was somewhere slightly different, and I was going to say the fewer energy transitions we make, in a sense, the better. And every energy transition, as we've heard, is not 100% efficient, and that lack of efficiency is expressed as heat or sound or light, all three being molecular vibrations, and we should use that more effectively. Could we heat up the Earth? I don't know. Douglas, do you...
Well, I mean, I was just going to respond by saying if you look at the figures that I had in my presentation and think about the amount of energy that's incident on the Earth from the sun, then human activity uses a tiny fraction of that. So although it is the case that human activity has resulted in the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere to over 400 parts per million, and that CO2 and indeed methane are greenhouse gases, and that is causing the Earth to warm up. In terms of the thermal radiation that human activity emits, it's insignificant compared to what arrives at the top of the atmosphere from the sun. So the reason the Earth is warming up is not because we are producing a lot of excess thermal energy that's going into the atmosphere. It's because the radiation that is being emitted by the sun is being trapped within the atmosphere because of the thermal properties of the gas in the atmosphere. So that's the process that's causing the warming. So this notion of everything ending up as thermal energy is correct. And scientists refer to the sort of heat death of the cosmos, where everything is at the same temperature. And then because of the laws of thermodynamics, no work gets done and everything is just, sort of, but that's billions of years in the future. So I wouldn't worry about it, really.
Thank you.
So much for entropy, then.
Yes.
Right.
Thermodynamics.
Mike has a mic. Mike has a mic.
Hi. Would you perhaps comment on the implications on demand, probably for electrical energy, mostly, to replace the existing infrastructure for internal combustion engine to electric vehicles? And in addition, could you comment on the implications for urban planning and the placement of new housing developments if we cannot develop a new infrastructure in time?
Truthfully, I don't think I can. Do we have... But yeah, it's a delightful question because, of course, we had a proclamation, it was, no doubt, a few months ago, that all cars in Britain sold by 2040 would be electric. And, of course, that then shifts demand. I think about 25 or 27% of our total energy usage at the moment is for vehicles. For transport, that would be trains as well as cars. So that would shift from fossil fuel to electricity generated somehow. So it's a great question. I don't have an answer. Would anyone from the Energy Institute like to tackle it? Chris? Sorry? The government seems to have an answer. Yeah.
Well, I mean, If I could make just a few brief observations. I mean, if you think about a typical internal combustion engine in a motor vehicle, which might be, I don't know, 70 to 100 horsepower in old-fashioned units, then, you know, a horsepower is 750 watts. So if you think about the amount of energy that you have to store in your vehicle to enable you to go and drive during the day. So if you think about charging points, I mean, if you've got at the moment, if you've got an electric vehicle that has a range of approximately 200 miles, something like a new Nissan Leaf, then you would need to plug it in at home, and it would take 8 hours overnight to charge up fully, drawing 13 amps from your supply. So something like 20 kilowatt hours. Sorry? Yes. But it depends on how much power you're putting into the battery, because they are building. Yes. Yes. Yeah, but if you then have a high energy charging point that they're building in London, then they can charge up a battery in less than half an hour. But you need a 3-phase 20 kilowatt supply. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, just one quick thing without microphone. Frank was the energy manager of a hospital, and when the power failure came, he had 2 standby generators. One didn't start up, the second one did, and he went, oh, thank heavens, otherwise he would have lost it. After a few discussions, we ran one generator all the time, making electricity. The hot water from the engine's cooling system and the exhaust drove the heating of the laundry, which is large in a hospital, and then he had electricity where the grid was just the backup supply. So if his diesel engine failed and the other one didn't start, the grid was the backup. So it actually turned the probabilities around. And also by swapping the generators over every week, and both generators were in fighting fit condition to start immediately. And save a heck of a lot of money for that hospital.
Can I just come back onto that and say, to address the second part of the question of the decisions on urban planning, an awful lot of new developments are lovely 3, 4, 5 bedroom executive houses built outside towns, as it were. Now, if we don't get an infrastructure in time, which means that we can drive in to a town, the problems that are going to be shown for people having to transport themselves from their home into either their place of work or to their local shopping centre and then carry goods all the way back are quite serious and don't seem to have entered into any concept of urban planning at all.
Well, none of us are urban planners, so I think we have a problem to answer that. But I can promise you, Mike, that if you care to drop the question to dei.sec@durham.ac.uk, and the same goes for us all here, we will endeavour to provide sensible answers over the next few weeks or so. But similarly, and I'm going to close now because I think I turn into a pumpkin shortly. The DEI runs a lot of different seminars and events. We have a monthly public lecture, for example, and you're very welcome to come along to that. And Claire will keep you up to date, if you so desire, with just what's going on. So, I'm worn out, but I've very much enjoyed myself today. As I said when we first opened today, your audience has quizzed me, now us, more than I've seen from industrialists, fellow academics, or indeed our student population. It keeps us sharp, it keeps us all sharp. So what I'm going to do is just say thank you to a few people, if I may. Thank you, first of all, to Lynn, Jackie, and the rest of the team who support DEI made this event happen. Thank you. Aside from Douglas at the speakers, there's Frank still in the audience, Helen, Janice somewhere, thank you, and those who've since disappeared, Charlotte, Andy, John, and John, for giving their time today. We didn't talk about wind. We have great expertise in wind. Maybe there's quite a bit of hot air as well. So, but, you know, there are opportunities perhaps to do something more in the future. So I thank the speakers and those who co-supported them with effort, putting slides together and so on. And indeed, the whole of my empire. And I've had a few comments just over coffee and lunch today from yourselves, from the audience, saying not only was some very good talks and informative, but just the layout of today worked very well indeed. So there are a group of people in the back, as it were, that we don't see very often, and I'd like to thank them as well. And we should all thank John as well, because it's his persistence in grabbing me at various events and saying, can you do a turn for us, which has brought about today. So thank you, John. And with that, I'll sit down.
Having been thanked, I think I'll leave John a challenge. In the long term, do you see that control, direction, management, whatever forms you look at, is the responsibility of the universities or the government? Perhaps we can have a talk on that another time.
Yes, perhaps, yes. Okay, thank you.
Okay,
I'm not going to answer it. I'm going to say thank you.
Like John, I think I'm very tired now, so I think it's time to go. So rather than read out what I'd written down to thank the university, I'm going to give it to Lynn and ask her to pass it round to everybody. But I think today, I don't know how we express our appreciation and thanks for today's conference. We've had a number of workshops and conferences before, but I have to say I think this one has been outstanding and the organisation has been absolutely brilliant. So thank you everybody for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks very much. Bye.